I think the core document, probably the most important document in the human rights movement. And so it'd be interesting for us to discuss what we think of it, especially in light of our discussions the last few days about different theories and different questions in human rights. So what I thought might be good is if we structure this morning as follows. I'll begin by talking about how I regard the document and some things I would change about the document. And then we'll break into groups, and we've made copies of the document. I think I asked for everybody to read this document in advance, but I think that didn't get communicated to you. So we've made enough copies of the declaration for us to break into 6 groups, and I thought that until coffee break the groups could discuss the document, and then when we come back we'll do something a little different. Rather than have reports from the group, what I thought is we could go through each piece of the document, and as individuals people could say what changes they would make, or what how they regard the document as a whole, how they regard the preamble, and how they regard each of the articles. And so I thought I would start this morning by talking about how I regard it, not because I have the one and only true answer, but just to give you a sense of how you might criticize it or what you might say about it. As I've tried to emphasize from the beginning, I think that human rights is an essentially contestable concept, or an indeterminate concept, which means that even though I've got a view of human rights as a political theorist, that and so I know what I mean by human rights, and I know why I value human rights. I can't say that you're wrong if you have a different conception. So for instance, I have a moral conception, which is connected to state sovereignty, but you might have a legal conception which has nothing to do with state sovereignty, and that doesn't mean that I'm right, you're wrong, or you're right that I'm wrong. So let me start off by saying that I am, the first question I think about the document is, do you think it's a good document? Do you think the human rights movement is a good movement? Because you could think it's terrible. You could look, for instance, at the last 62 years since it was written and say, look at all the interventions. What you have is you've got Western powers intervening in other countries, being imperialistic, and they're doing it under the cover of human rights. They say, oh, we're going in here to protect human rights. But that's not what they're doing. What they're doing is they're just trying to protect their state interest, and human rights gives them an excuse to do so. So you could say, I wish there was never a human rights movement, because I think the world would be more peaceful. I think that societies would be able to be more self-determining, because they wouldn't have to worry about people interfering. You could feel that way. I don't feel that way. I'm a big fan of the human rights movement. And as I mentioned, and I think Russ mentioned, I conceive of these human rights as moral rights. And I'm a realist like Russ. I'm not a relativist. For me, these rights exist whether or not people recognize them. It doesn't matter whether any given country, whether it be Russia, the United States, Ukraine, recognizes a human right. I think these rights exist, and they should be respected, whether or not they are. And so I think that I see this document as being an incredibly important way to put countries on notice of what's expected of them. So the United States has all kinds of problems with disrespecting very important rights. But I think that they have many fewer problems than they would have were it not for the Constitution. The Constitution allows, so the United States, as you know, has got 50 different states, and there's a lot of variety in the states. The different states have their own education systems, right? They're able to tax and provide services, and they say, you know, so Russ lives in Wisconsin, I live in Missouri. You okay? Okay. Russ lives in Wisconsin, and I live in Missouri. And the United States says, you know, if people in Wisconsin want to organize themselves in one way, that's fine. If people want to organize them in Missouri, want to organize themselves in a different way, that's also fine. But what the Constitution says is whatever you do, you may not violate these rights. Okay, so there's room for self-determination, there's room for variety, as long as you treat each individual in accord with these rights. And I think that this document can play and should play a similar role internationally, globally. It's not to say that every country should be the same. Ukraine should be free to organize themselves very differently than Russia. And Russia should be free to organize themselves very differently than the United States. It's not that there's no room for political self-determination. But the idea is that within the limits, or the self-determination is limited by the moral rights. And so we say to, this document says to all the countries, organize yourselves however you want as long as you respect these things. And we will not recognize your legitimacy unless you respect these things. And so the idea is, I mean, if you think about states, they're incredibly powerful. And they ask an enormous amount of their citizens. A country will ask you to die or to kill for the country. That's an enormous amount of allegiance, right? And this document says, if you want to make these types of claims to allegiance, then at the very least, you've got to respect and protect certain basic rights. Maybe it's the ones on this list, maybe it's not the ones on this list. That's for us to discuss today. But the idea is, if you're going to tell your people, if you're going to impose yourself without the permission on a people and tell them that they must sacrifice for this government, you have no business doing that, right? Unless at the very least you respect and protect their basic rights. And if you can't do that, how can you claim you must sacrifice for me, you must kill for us, you must die for us, all right, if you can't do merely that? Okay, so this is, I conceive of this document as saying there's sort of a minimal floor. And it's saying to the world that if a country does this, if a country can do these things, then you must leave it alone. Then if they want to organize themselves in ways that you don't like or that you don't want to organize yourself, that's not your business. All right? You've got to leave the country alone. It's legitimate and it deserves your respect, and you shouldn't interfere with it as long as it does these things. But you say to the countries, if you don't do these things, you are not entitled to global respect. If you can't do this, not only can you not ask of your citizens, you must sacrifice for us, but you cannot ask of foreigners, you need to leave us alone. Right? You're not entitled to self-determination, either internal or external, unless you do these minimal things. So, I'm a huge fan of this document. Let me say a few things that I might change. Right? The first is the preamble, is that I would make what I just said clear, that these are the rules for legitimacy, and these are the expectations that we have of all states. Okay? One thing I might take out of the preamble is that in the preamble it's emphasized that part of the reason we have this Universal Declaration of Human Rights is because we want there to be less war between states. And we think there's a connection between respecting human rights and being a bellicose country, being a country that's going to be aggressive in war. I understand that the United Nations was set up, right, first and foremost to try and avoid interstate war. And but I think I might take that out of the preamble for two reasons. First of all, it's not clear that it's true that there's any empirical connection between how countries treat their insiders and whether they're more or less likely to go to war. All right? The United States, in my view, as I've said, does, I think, a relatively good job respecting the rights of its citizens. I think it does a very poor job respecting the rights of foreigners. Right? So I think I think it's too quick. We need more empirical evidence to think that, well, if someone respects human rights internally, then they're not going to go to war. But second, and more importantly, even if there was that connection, I'm not sure I'd put it in there because it dilutes, I think, from the message that I would want this document to convey. The message that I would want to make is not that, oh, the world would be a better place, but instead the point is that each individual has these rights, and that's what I would want emphasized. So to the extent that you put more things in the preamble, say, well, it's good because of this or that or whatever, I would say, no, this is why we're demanding it, is because people have a right that they not be tortured, and they have a right to life, and they have a right to liberty, okay? So I might tinker with the, although I'm a huge fan of this, I might tinker with the preamble. Now what about the articles? So there are 30 articles, and I will just comment on 3, and then we'll divide into groups and see what you guys think. All right, so first one is one that I'm the most confident that I would change. And this is the article about periodic holidays with pay. Okay? So let me find and read this one. It's relatively late. 24. It reads, everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitations of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. Now this is not an easy question for me, and I'll tell you why. So you know, I mentioned the first morning that the way I am inclined to understand human rights, they're as individual moral rights that are connected to living a minimally decent human life. And I take very seriously that someone's life would be miserable if she had to work 18 hours a day, day after day after day, for such a low wage, right, that she could never take any time off, right? This is not a good life. It's certainly not a good life. It's not clear that it's minimally decent. So there's something about the human life that there's got to be some leisure in it, right? The human spirit is such that it's got to be rejuvenated, and the intellect and the playful parts of the human personality need to be exercised. So I get that, and so I'm not entirely unsympathetic to there being something like Article 24, okay? But at the very least, I would word it differently because of some of the things that we talked about yesterday, right? There are worries about rights inflation, and there are worries that the more you add in that have greater expectations, then people become unsympathetic to the whole human rights project. They become critical of the whole human rights project. So people say, for instance, holidays with pay. So they imagine people on the Adriatic coast, right? So who's supposed to pay for that? That's a human right? That's crazy, okay? And so what it does is the more ambitious the positive rights that you posit in a document like this, the more skepticism there is, and the harder it is for the movement to get traction, right? And so if you want this document to be taken seriously, and you want to insist that it be respected, then I think you want to demand less and you have fewer rights. So that's one thing that I would modify. I'm not sure I would take it out, but I certainly wouldn't say something about holidays with pay. I would say something about limitation of working hours and stuff like that. Now, something that's very interesting, this is the one I want to talk the most about, is Article 21. So this is the article which is basically understood to be the basis for the idea that there's a human right to democracy. It says, everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives, Everyone has the right to equal access to public service in this country. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be universal, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. So the Article 21 doesn't mention democracy by name, but it essentially says that every individual has a right that government be decided democratically. I'm a fan of democracy. Democracy's great. So why wouldn't I want an article in here? It's the same concern, is that if we're going to take these standards seriously and we're going to say to a country, you have to do these minimal things, otherwise it's okay for us to interfere with you, right? Then they have to be of a certain urgency, and they have to be, I think, connected to something like dignity, or I would say the minimally decent human life. And here's the idea, the core idea. It seems to me that you can live in a non-democratic government and live a very good life. It depends. It depends upon how things are ordered. It depends upon how the rulers rule and things like this. But the democracy itself, the lack of democracy, the lack of having a vote, the lack of periodic elections, it seems to me doesn't directly interfere with your ability to live a minimally decent human life. If you had a ruler, if you had some queen, right, who had complete control, she had no elections, but she let you live your life, and she didn't torture, and she respected the other rights here, I think you could have a quite good life. Okay?
Well, you can say that that's a right, not the obligation. So one can live in a monarchy without taking part in it.
Right. So the point is exactly, you could live in a monarchy and still have a minimally decent life. So for my conception, and this is why I'm just suggesting how I think of these things, because many of you I know have very different conceptions of a human right, very different ideas about how we should understand human rights. So my first inclination is to say, take Article 21 out. We don't need it. But let me tell you why that's too quick. Okay? The reason why it's too quick is because I think that there's an important connection between democracy and these other articles. Right? So I'm a philosopher, and I could say, imagine a queen. Right? Imagine a queen, and she respects you, and she doesn't torture you, and she insists that the police act certain ways. And you can say, yeah, I can imagine that. And now I say, imagine what it's like to live in this monarchy. Could you live a minimally decent life? You say, I could live a quite good life. So okay, get rid of it, right?
There is no guarantee.
Pardon me?
No guarantee for the next day.
Right. The thing is, look at the real world, right? And there's an undeniable connection between democracy, a genuine democracy, when people have these things, and the other rights being respected. Okay? If you've got a regime which is torturing people, if you've got a regime which is not providing these other basic rights, then they'll be voted out of office, right? Because of the responsiveness to the electorate, to the people, these other human rights tend to be respected a great deal more and tend to be protected a great deal more when we live in a democracy, right? So for me, it's a tough question. I don't think there's a human right to democracy, but I think we have human rights related reasons to want democracy. If you care, if any of you is going to work in your country to make human rights respected, one of the things you're going to want is you're going to want elections, you're going to want media, you're going to want freedom of association, right? Things like this, probably multiple parties. Not because the media is necessary to living a minimally decent life. It's not like, well, if I can't turn on the television, my life would be terrible. Why get up in the morning? No, bless you. It's not that. The point is that the media is so important because if you've got a strong, free, independent media, then it's going to stop the government, it's going to help stop the government from human rights abuses. Okay? So that's part of democracy. So I'm a huge fan of democracy, even though I don't think there's necessarily a human right to democracy. So here's the question for me, and it's a tough question. If I were drafting this document, even though I don't think there's a human right to democracy, would I leave this in here? I probably would. I would probably act as if there's a human right to democracy, because democracy is so important for the other human rights. And in the real world, not the philosopher's imaginary world, where we can imagine queens who are entirely benevolent, right? But in the real world, if you care about these things, then you will want democracy. So there's the thing. And the other thing that I mentioned this yesterday, and this connects to bytes and to POGI, okay? I think I would expand Article 24. I'm sorry, 28. Article 28 says, everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. Okay. And this is what POGI makes a lot of. An international order in which rights and freedoms set forth. And so drawing on bytes and POGI, and as I mentioned, my view of human rights is in important ways different from bytes and different from POGI. But I would expand this, and I would make it clear that two things, right? First and foremost, in my view, we want to hold states accountable to their own citizens. And this document is first and foremost about saying to the world states, right, this is what you have to do to be legitimate, in my view. Okay? So these are the articles that I would come up with. But we know that there are going to be states which are either unable or unwilling to perform these functions. Right? We're going to have situations like Somalia, where the state cannot protect its people. The state is not strong enough. Right? We're going to have situations like the former Yugoslavia, right? Where the state is unwilling to protect ethnic minorities. All right? And so what do you say then? Now, one thing you can say, we talked about the issue of duty bearers yesterday. One thing you can say is, if you want to set the duty bearers, you can say it's not just that first and foremost the states, it's only the states. And so who is the duty bearers for human rights? It's only the fellow citizens. I don't want to say that, though. I think first and foremost, your fellow citizens are responsible for protecting each other. But in cases where the constituents are unable to do this, either because the government doesn't work or it works in an evil fashion, then I think the responsibility falls to the world as a whole. Okay? And so I would expand 28 to say that, and this is Beitz's idea, right, of the two levels, right? That in the case where states break down, either because of inabilities or unwillingness to respect the Declaration, right, then it's the responsibility of the world as a whole, right? And the wording here I think is important. I don't think that we should think, okay, well, suppose something bad happens in Norway, Sweden should go in, right? Or something bad happens in Chad, Nigeria should go in. Rather, I think what we want to do is it's the responsibility of everyone in the world to try and set up supranational institutions that don't involve one country assisting another country, or more importantly, one country invading or interfering with another country. Because we want these things to be multinational to avoid just the types of concerns I began with, which is states using the excuse of human rights to invade other countries. Right? So I would expand Article 28, right, to say that it's the responsibility of everybody in the world, especially the wealthy citizens in the wealthy countries, right, to establish global institutions, something like the International Criminal Court, I think is a great example, right? That's just one. But global institutions which will be able to help those countries, like Somalia, right, which are unable to perform the jobs on their own, and which will be in a position to, in a multilateral fashion, interfere in countries like the former Yugoslavia when they're unwilling to respect the rights. And I think that if you expand Article 28 in this way, just the way that I think Poggi would recommend, right, then you would have a more equitable, safer way for us to monitor the world, and it would put states on notice, it would give some teeth to this document, right? If you had an institution, if you had these institutions, it would change the incentive structure. So think already about what the International Criminal Court is doing for the incentive structure of tyrants, right? I mentioned yesterday that it's no accident that there's so much suffering in the world, right? And this is because everything is set up to provide incentives for rulers to mistreat their subjects. And in many non-democratic countries, there are no incentives for rulers, or very few incentives for the rulers to treat their constituents well. And so a lot of rulers treat their citizens horrifically, and they don't have to worry about it. But if you set up an international criminal court, the idea is not that you're going to punish every rights violation. It's not even that you're going to punish every gross rights violation, but you change the incentive structure. All of a sudden, a ruler doesn't just have to worry about his own citizens over whom he's got incredible power. He's got to worry about what happens if he gets apprehended and then prosecuted and punished by the International Criminal Court. And this changes things. And so you hopefully have fewer human rights atrocities. So I think that Article 28 is crucial, and I understand that the people who drafted this document had political limitations. They weren't sitting in a luxurious resort in the mountains of the Ukraine just getting to think, how would I do things? They were responsible to governments, and so they had to put in very limited things. But if I'm designing things, and I don't have to worry about whether my country is going to ratify it or whether the UN is going to accept it, I would build in 28 much more ambitiously. Okay, so those are just some of my thoughts.
May I ask you,
Yeah, by all means.
don't you think that the word international order in the Article 28 or 29,
28.
28 also include that what you wanted to say? International order.
It includes what I wanted to say?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that's the idea. But I would, my point is that, and that's why Thomas Poggi, about whom I spoke yesterday, I think places so much emphasis on 28. And so my point is not that I'm skeptical of 28, but that I would expand it to make much more explicit that we want, the way we understand this international order is to be able in a multilateral fashion to assist or maybe even interfere with governments. Yeah, so I do see it that way. Okay.
Question.
Yeah.
Did the U.S. ratify the declaration in its entirety? Entirely?
I believe so, but the thing about the declaration is it's not a binding treaty,
It's not a binding.
right?
But it had to be considered, so it had to be.
It's just a declaration, and so it doesn't have any binding, right? And so that's how they were able to. So it's sort of aspirational, but the U.S., for instance, now this is an important question, a great general question, right? Think about the United States with respect to the International Criminal Court, right? The U.S. will not ratify the International Criminal Court because the United States very jealously protects its sovereignty, right? It doesn't want to let anybody with any control. So the U.S. wants to do what it wants to do, and it doesn't want to sign over anything, okay? And so many of us in the U.S. lobby on behalf of things like the International Criminal Court, and it falls on deaf ears among the politicians, right? So that's why there's a that's why I said there's a difference between a philosopher at a resort talking about this and then politicians who have to write something that can get accepted. So the International Criminal Court, for instance, emerged from the 1998 Rome Statute. And what happened in Rome is the U.S. representatives had all kinds of influence, and the International Criminal Court was much weaker than it might have been because they were hoping to get ratification from the United States. And interestingly, at this time, Bill Clinton was dealing with the Monica Lewinsky scandal, so he, the delegate, the chief delegate from the United States was in fact reporting to Hillary rather than Bill Clinton, because Bill was doing damage control the whole time, to give you a sense of the way real politics work. So in order to keep the U.S. on board, the ICC is much different and much less ambitious than it might have been, but then the United States, of course, didn't ratify it in the end anyway, because they don't want anybody else, they don't want to sign over the rights for anybody else to punish U.S. citizens. Right? Yeah.
I have a question. I don't know exactly. For instance, the European Court of Human Rights or International Criminal Court, they refer to the declaration as a binding document. Or for instance, they can, in cases involve other countries. In the European Court of Human Rights, it can refer to the UN Convention of 1966 for explanation of the articles. What does it mean? I
Right.
mean, what is motivation? Do you know any cases of International Court of Justice when it referred to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
I don't. I just don't know that. I don't know that literature well. There may be many, but I don't know of any.
Do you know, guys, вы знаете, где есть решение Международного суда, вот, что он основывался на Декларацию прав человека? Вот Европейский суд это делает, International Criminal Court это делает, хотя они вроде бы не связываются, но они так делают.
Европейский суд основывается на конвенции.
Он основывается, а для толкования статей конвенции, он также основывается на Декларацию прав
Но для
человека.
толкования, но сама декларация не есть binding.
Я
она не
объясняю, он aspirational декларация, но для толкования статей очень часто Европейский суд основывается и на 66-е вот эти конвенции ООН, и на вот Декларацию прав человека, да, вот эти моменты.
Толкование он может использовать и вспомогательный материал,
Да.
например. От этого не становится обязательным.
Но это не то, что вы говорите, это типа полуобязательно.
So I will say this, because having mentioned that this was passed merely as a declaration, not as a binding document, the interesting thing about international law is that a great deal of its source is customary law, right? And so the international law is not, the International Human Rights Project is, as Bites emphasized, we talked about Bites, it's an emerging practice. It's not like a full-fledged state system where you can look at statutes and things like this and you can get clarity. And a lot of what's taken to be international law is from custom. And so even though the declaration was passed merely as a declaration, it wasn't supposed to be binding, because of the respect that it's had over the years, it's come to have a seen as a binding force in a lot of areas. Some people question whether it should or how. I mean, it's a matter of great scholarly debate in international law, but that's how things have been conceived. So, look, I want to emphasize again, my thoughts are just my thoughts. This is just one way of thinking about the Declaration, which stems from my understanding of a human right. Right? So this is not to say that this is what anyone else in the room should think. But I just wanted to give examples of how you might regard it. Okay? So before we break into groups and I distribute this, I want to go over again what I hope we'll discuss after the coffee break. So I think that we can discuss in groups until the coffee break, have the coffee break, and then what I want to do is first and most interesting question is I'd be curious to hear if anybody thinks that the human rights movement is a terrible movement, right? So you could say, no, I don't like the Declaration at all because I'm against human rights, and here's why, right? It's the parochialism objection, for instance. It's just U.S.-led imperialism, or something like this. So the first question is, do you think there should even be a declaration? Right? Because I think it's a great thing. I'm a big fan of the U.S. Constitution, and for similar reasons, I'm a huge fan of the Declaration. Bless you. But the first question is, should there be one at all? And then the next question is, what about the preamble? Is there anything you change about the preamble? And then we'll go through, let's go through all the articles. And it'd be interesting, I talked about some that I might change and some that I might delete, okay? But there might also be some that people think we should add, right? You might put in things about groups. This was one of the questions I brought up the other day, right? Is this lacking, is this document sorely lacking because it doesn't include any group rights? Okay? Should it say more things about the environment? Right? This was written 62 years ago, right? Now we recognize the environmental concerns. Yesterday we were talking about, poverty, and we raised the concern, well, maybe the problem is there are too many people. And the population is a problem. These are the types of things. So there may be new articles that you think should be added. All right, so in addition to talking about the preamble and whether there should be one of these things and going through all the articles, so we'll be interested in whether people think they should delete any of the take any of the articles out, whether anybody thinks that we should change any articles in important ways, and then finally we'll conclude by talking about whether we should add any articles. Okay, so I don't have enough copies for everybody to have one, but that's why if we break into groups, maybe the groups can discuss these. And we'll do the same thing. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The former Soviet Union is a geopolitical catastrophe, and it's made lives worse. Do you believe that?
No.
No, of course, but at the same time, there are a real degradation
Yeah.
of our social, economical,
Right.
cultural life. All former Soviet Republic live now in very
Right.
difficult.
I
And
think if we could establish a good democracies, we could say that it's totally wrong, that it's the word of Putin. But unfortunately, we couldn't establish a good democracy in an article of
Yeah.
the Soviet.
Yeah, so there's an expression in the United States, the jury is still out. Do you know this expression?
What's that again?
So the jury is still out means, so say I'm a defendant being tried for murder, okay? And the prosecution rests, the defense rests, the jury goes off to consider whether to find me innocent or guilty, okay? And somebody says, what's the verdict? Innocent or guilty? And if the verdict hasn't been turned in yet, they say, the jury's still out. In other words, the jury hasn't come back and said what the verdict is. But that's a metaphor that people use. For instance, some people believe the U.S.-led incursion into Iraq was permissible. Many people think it's impermissible. Some people say, if you ask them to say, was the U.S.-led intervention into Iraq justified? They say, the jury is still out, which means we don't know yet. We'll see what happens. If there's a healthy democracy 10 years from now, then it was justified. If 10 years from now we have an ongoing bloody civil war, then clearly it wasn't justified. So do you think the sensible thing to say about the former Soviet Union is that whether it's been benefited or harmed by the human rights movement, say the jury's still out? There are many people who are worse off, but the hope is that we're going to have healthy democracies in many of the former republics, and that they're going to have economic systems which are more robust, and maybe 8, maybe 20, maybe 28 years from now, things are much better than they would have been had the Soviet regime continued. And so you might, I'm not saying you should say, but some people might say, did the human rights movement help the former Soviet Union? The jury's still out. You can't say it helped them because so many people are worse off.